Hello and welcome to the Super 70 Podcast, episode 27. Akira! I will be using the 124-minute Kodansha Funimation Blu-ray release from 2012. You can, of course, find Akira on Amazon Prime and Vudu for purchase, but if you are subscribers to Funimation, Hulu, or Tubi, it is currently licensed through those platforms. If you press play on the Blu-ray now, you'll be ahead a second or two as the others load. Katsuhiro Otomo was 34 years old when he formed the Akira Committee, consisting of the heads of several different Japanese media syndicates, including the Toho Corporation, the largest distributor of films in Japan, to fund and produce an animation of Otomo's own manga, which he wrote and drew himself, using a small staff of artists to fill. We pan across the modern city of Tokyo in 1988, a city teeming with tens of millions of people, and we watch them get wiped out by an enormous explosion of a type we assume to be atomic in nature. The all-white blast matches the blast we will see in the ending, leaving no doubt that both events were caused by the same phenomena. We think we are watching the resulting fireball for a few seconds until it contorts into a bird's eye view of Tokyo Bay. Only the bay itself is now filled with a city. This city is Neo-Tokyo. The screen informs us it is the year 31 after the Third World War, which we are also guessing was started or ended with the previous supposedly atomic blast. The year 2019 is also the year Rick Deckard hunted replicant humans in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, and we will see this is not the last comparison we will make of that film. Otomo shows us Akira in large type to deliberately contrast the smallness that we will meet at the end of the film. In fact, there are a lot of big things happening from small people. And we will see the inverse is true. Large people seem to be capable of only small actions in the world of Akira and his colleagues. On the screen, we see the number of 19, a repeating reference to 2019, and the number 19, a character in the manga which was not used in the same way in this film. The bar gives us our immediate setting, the seedy underlife of Neo-Tokyo's biker gangs. The crime-ridden world, though, will soon give way to larger issues. The politics of oppression, what that oppression is trying to control, and what happens to the universe when that control is lost. And now it's time to introduce our guest host from the Film is Lit podcast. Please welcome Laura Seiling.
Hello. My job isn't to believe or disbelieve. It is to act or not act.
Danny Gaylord.
Better than your hog's piss. That's a little too crass.
No, not at all. And Ryan Burns.
Heads up, Tetsuo.
My dear audience, the Film is Lit podcast did an episode on Akira that I found so enlightening that I actually thought about canceling this episode. However, decided instead to invite Film is Lit to the Super 70 to help me break down the film as we go through it. And since we are witnessing a critical piece of the movie unfold in the beginning, I'd like to ask Ryan, if I remember from the Film is Lit episode, you have read the entire manga, have you not?
Yes, I have.
All right. What is the difference, say, between the first 20 minutes of the film and the first 100 or so pages of the manga?
So it's interesting. They both start out similarly, introducing the biker gang and kind of focusing on in the first 30 pages or so the crash between Tetsuo and Takashi. That's right off the bat, essentially, just like in the movie, it's a little more drawn out. It's a little more character development. There's kind of the scene with the bar. They leave the bar and they get on the bikes, and then the kind of the battle between the biker gangs ensues. And in the manga, it's not so much the battle between the biker gangs that leads to that crash, but there's a little bit more in the manga kind of right around 45 or 50. There's more of a militaristic presence in the first 100 pages or so. So we don't really get exposed to kind of the military's involvement in everything in the movie until a little bit later. So there's kind of some separation there between the two. But in the movie, we see more of a focus on the central characters leading up to the initial crash between Tetsuo and Takashi, and how that kind of sets off the events for everything in the film. From there, in the manga, it's a little bit different in that there's just some different players involved with the events leading up to that specific point.
Yeah, a lot of characters that are left out entirely, and we can get into that later. Here, Tetsuo slides off his bike because he is not the best rider of the gang, and this entire sequence reminds me specifically of Blade Runner, and actually probably more of 2049 than the original.
Yeah,
it's almost like 2049 took a lot from the original. These plates I want to get to soon, and then I heard you guys mention on your podcast on Film is Lit how this was really reminiscent of Tron, which was only 4 years before.
Yeah, Tron, and I think it took inspiration from Tron, but then Tron Legacy, decades later, really capitalized on this imagery of the streaks, of it being a little bit more rounded and having it fade away, as opposed to the original Tron film, how it was just a single hard line that stayed the whole time. I think certainly the biggest two inspirations for Akira were Blade Runner and Tron, but the amount of stuff that then came out of Akira is just vast.
Well, it's almost like both of those sequels took notes from Akira as opposed to originally from the first film. So Bosozoku is in kanji, actually, one of the three alphabets of Japanese. And it has three meanings: violence or cruelty, running or race, and tribe, all in the same word.
Wow.
Cool.
So there's your Japanese lesson for today.
I am honestly just taking all the colors in because I've been studying a lot about how the colors sort of play into this movie. And like the streaks, I think, were the first thing that I was really interested in because I had never seen Tron. And I think that's just such a beautiful way of showing movement in anime. And I've just been reading about how there were, I think, like 50 new colors that had never been used in animation before this film. And I think the choice of coloring sort of goes toward making it more realistic and less abstract coloring. Because I think, kind of take for the Simpsons, for example, like they're, yellow, kind of, that's what abstract coloring is. But this movie goes more toward like realistic coloring. And I think that they did that because they didn't want it to be seen as like a foreign, like weird, quote unquote, Japanese film. But it just stands out so much. Like this movie just looks different than any kind of anime that's out there.
And already we're introduced to two different color palettes. They used one color palette for the opening, which is the biker race. And now they've switched, and now we're in more of a ghetto. And the color palette is really subdued, even though you have a little bit of neon here. So that's very interesting. It was kind of like the problem that they had with Pocahontas, where they spent 5 extra years doing that film for Disney because they had to invent new colors because they wanted to look smokier. Really?
I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. The biker riots in the 70s were the background to the Bosozoku. They actually have a code in the biker gang, which is slightly more militaristic than anything else in civil society. In 1988, you could not drive a car until you were 21, but you could drive a two-wheeled vehicle at the age of 16. And this is also the age that corresponds with the traditional Japanese age from adolescence to manhood. So the fact that you could drive a bike right in between that time puts you into a culture immediately just because of the age that you were born.
Yeah.
Right. In this specific time, in this specific place. Now, there were, in 1988, 42,000 members of these bike gangs. And guess what the three most popular films in 1988 were in Japan? Number one, The Road Warrior. Number two, Clockwork Orange. Number three, Easy Rider. And actually the fourth one was Tron.
Oh, wow. I thought you were going to bring up Akira. Okay, cool.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting what you said about maybe the Japanese were not trying to make some of the violence here. Every time I see the scene, I'm just thinking, oh my God, what am I watching? Platoon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. I'm sorry to finish that thought. Interesting what you're saying about them maybe not trying to make this look as Japanese as it could, when in fact Otomo said that he had no outside market in mind, and it always surprised him that Akira was an enormous global success, especially in France.
Well, I think that I read that George Lucas said it was not going to be marketable in the States. He didn't want to touch it. And I think that's the beauty of more modern cinema. I hope that more modern audiences are, open to receiving things from different cultures and not just seeing it through an American lens. Because this is not like any American anime or adult animation that I've ever seen. And I think that's a good thing. We should be open to receiving things from other cultures, and especially for a piece that's so culturally infused, I guess, with the violence and culture of post-World War II. I think we need to learn that from something that's not been sort of sifted through an American lens.
American cinema is probably the most self-reflexive cultural aspect of our society. It is not reflective of, in my opinion, the populace at large, despite the fact that they go so frequently. Everyone loves to go to Marvel films. They don't really actually think, why is it that we're constantly fighting apocalypses after 9/11? That's not really entering their mind, right? So I tend to agree with you. But as we know, most Americans don't even own a passport.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, and the riots here directly inspired by Otomo's own experiences in the 1960s, where there were, just like anywhere else that there were in France and the United States in the 60s, there were riots in every democratic country. There were riots in Israel over what was happening. There were riots in Germany about what was happening in Vietnam. How dare these bombers come to Okinawa before they go to Vietnam to bomb these places?
Yeah, it's so interesting. There's the bike again with the streaks. How the decision to make this film take place in night prominently, and you brought up colors, Laura, about how animated films during that time mostly took place during the day, as to so there wasn't as high a contrast. You didn't have to implement as many colors, but Otomo going for that realism, you had to bring in these new colors, and a result of that are these vibrant reds. So the smoke in the riots, you can clearly see as this enveloping force, and all the blood is kind of this exaggerated red as opposed to the darker red that you normally see. And I think it adds to the visceral nature of the violence.
It's more than just violent. It's ultra violent.
Yeah.
And for a kid who grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons and was hooked on Space Ghost, to come and see this was just, it was outside my realm of understanding. You can show murder in a manga, or an anime. How is that even accepted or possible? This is rated R. How is it that a cartoon is rated R? Now, I know we had heavy metal before this, but heavy metal was kind of like a perverted thing you do with extra cash in Hollywood. It's not actually the norm, right? This is the norm in the East. Now it is. Akira made it so, right? But manga was an adult film industry before Akira for decades. Manga itself was not for kids. It was for adults. The Flintstone market, was in Japan, but it is considered something else.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you brought up A Clockwork Orange, because I hadn't made that connection, but now that you say ultraviolence, like that's exactly what this movie is.
Yeah, and like gangs in a dystopian future. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Takeshi there in this floating Professor X platform that he has.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is probably my favorite character in the manga series. I read the first 3 volumes.
Takeshi?
Takeshi and the other Esper in the floating orb there. His name?
Masuro,
yes. Yeah.
Don't worry, it took me about 2,000 pages to get that down to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read all 6 of them in a span of 3 weeks. It was pretty crazy. Any 2 minutes you can go through this film and you can point this out. But if you see the movement on screen of the stuff flying around in the background, the movement of their arms, or even when Canada's collar was floating in the wind there, even these shoes that are marching, you immediately know there's an enormous difference between this and Hanna-Barbera.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me forever to figure out why is it that this flows faster. And that is because I looked it up. That is because the standard in the film industry, does anybody know what the FPS is in the film industry? 24 or 23
yes,
points. Exactly. Yeah. What is it for television about 1980 worldwide?
30, right?
10.
Oh, the opposite. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. And what is it for cartoons?
I'm not sure. Even less?
8.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
So now with early television, particularly in the 60s, which was mainly black and white, color TV would not really take over until 1967, 1968. And then the broadcast really didn't go full force until 1969. It was never really that big of an issue because you couldn't see stuff on TV at home over broadcast at that rate anyway. Mm-hmm. The cathode ray tube was just not strong enough to show you that many frame rates. So nobody cared. Mm-hmm. But by the time you get to the 80s, everyone has a TV that's 10 years or younger. And so the frame rate all of a sudden matters. And Otomo knew this. Now, I worked it out. For a 2-hour film with 7,200 seconds at 24 FPS, there must be 172,800 frames.
Seems like a lot.
Now, that's an obsessive amount, but if you're shooting on film, you spend that without even thinking. But in Akira, you're drawing it. Now, each individual cell in Akira is not photographed. So, for instance, you've got shots like this that go on for several seconds. That's fine. But in some of the takes, particularly in the opening takes, they are panning. And when you're pan, you have one enormous cell that might be twice the width of the screen. And then you move your camera across that. So you're only really painting one large cell, which is theoretically is not going to take you the same amount of time as if you did 5 or 6. So there is some, I won't say cheating involved, but you're not really talking about 172,000 cells that you have to individually do. But when you think about Sleeping Beauty, when you think about Snow White, when you think about the standard for them was 12 frames per second, or maybe 15 if they felt, let's spend a lot of money, 15 frames per second. You're still going to notice when the dwarves are flying around this enormous gap in motion, which does not exist in Akira. There are some things that go on where you think, well, there's some jerky motion, but on the whole, there's a whole lot more fluid movement. And what kills me about this entire argument is The Hobbit came out at 48 frames per second, and people lost their minds. They thought it was extravagant. Now, I saw Shang-Chi in theaters last week, and there was movement across that screen that I could not see. Why did I pay $12 to go see a martial arts fight that I can't see the punches in?
Yeah.
That to me sounds just very stupid. I know it's happening on a screen that's 17 times what I have in our modern theater, but I really feel like Peter Jackson was unduly spayed during that entire scene. He's just trying to give the viewer what he wants. And it's digital. What do you care if it's 48 frames per second? It's not your hard drive. Come on.
Yeah. Right. You're not winning a contest. Yeah. I saw Gemini Man 2 years ago, and that was at, what was it, 128 frames per second?
Oh, my God.
Jeez.
And I respect the experiment of it all. It is cool to just test that out, but it is so much visual information that it is too much. It is sensory overload. And also you kind of need that sweet spot of the amount of frames where there are certain gaps and your mind will fill those gaps. But when you have 128 frames, it doesn't feel like you're watching a moving picture, if that makes sense. Everything melds together, and it actually ends up looking cheap because you're just seeing everything as clear as you can get. And with normal like cinematic lighting, those, with the 24 frames, it creates that cinematic look, that quote unquote that I learned in film school, that where you actually kind of need that sweet spot. If you have too many frames, you need to light the set up more so you can capture that information, and then overlighting makes your film look cheap. So that's a whole other thing we could talk about.
Well, yeah, but there's very subtle things going on, like Kay, the introduction of this very important character that is unfortunately does not have enough screen time, in my opinion. Kay shifted her shoulders in that last shot, and it's a very nuanced movement that only the creator cares about, because he's adding something to the character for the audience, right? And that shift with that FPS, why would you care if this were half the frames per second? Nobody would even bother, right? It's because it's Speed Racer or whatever, and I'm not dogging Speed Racer, and I'm a huge fan of that, but there's definitely a difference going on. So in the introduction of Kay, because Kay is here, I do want to bring up, okay, Ryan, now that Kay is in the picture, what is Canada's real goal in this entire endeavor?
It's in terms of when he meets Kay.
I mean, really?
I mean, he is off the bat infatuated with her. I mean, I think she's very attractive, and he's kind of like, how can I, kind of take her out? And he's completely unaware at this point as to what she's working on with kind of the resistance movement. And they kind of cross paths when they get taken into custody. And then once they get out, he's kind of like, but I mean, he does his part in getting her out from kind of the police interrogation scene. And then he's immediately kind of trying to, kind of get her number.
Yeah. I mean, he's a skirt chaser. I mean, Canada is shameless.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the manga, she's constantly telling him, you're sick. She slaps him, and I know it's on your mind. And, and she's right. She's absolutely right. And in the manga, probably the two most honest people in the manga is Kay and Tetsuo. Right. Canada seems to have two goals. One is to get into Kay's panties, and the other one is to stop Tetsuo. And they're both born out of this shameless masculinity, which comes out of Japan at the time. And I find it hard to believe that Otomo did that without knowing about it. Like, he wasn't commenting on what this shameless masculinity was doing, right? Even at the end of the manga, which, spoilers if you have not read the manga, when they're on the bike and they're driving into what's left of New Tokyo, Kay's on the back of the bike, and you see the look on Canada's face. Victory. But yes, I bet Tetsuo. Yes, I mean, we all know I beat Tetsuo. That's fine. But what do I really care about? It's this girl on my bike is what I really care. That's why, there's this whole other thing that we're going to go into then when we get into Tetsuo, which is the Napoleon complex, and the fact that Tetsuo was not even a second or string fiddle, despite the fact that he was ostensibly Canada's best friend, right? But Tetsuo was never cool enough to be the leader of the gang, and the fact that he was rebelling like this and being the leader of the clowns and doing all these things that Canada was telling him not to do, Canada just couldn't take it. He couldn't take insubordination. That's a very Japanese idea with their caste system that they have of, look, this person is older, you are inferior, you just got this job, or you sweep the floors, or whatever it is. It's almost like India without brand names for castes, right?
Yeah, I want to talk about this scene in particular because I think the idea of becoming an adolescent and going through that visceral experience was my way into this movie and the manga in a lot of ways, because I found it really hard to watch. Like I kind of have a low violence threshold, and there are a lot of times in this, like when the coach slaps all of the kids, I was like, oh my God, like this is just beyond what I can handle. And then we started talking about, funnily enough, Big Mouth during our podcast episode. And I think that overstated violence and, you know, the way we were talking about sort of growing through adolescence, like that made me really appreciate how overblown the violence and the experience of this whole movie is, because you go through adolescence and it does feel like this. It does feel like everyone's out to get you, and nothing can go right. And, you know, you try to do the right thing and you still get in trouble. That was really my way into this movie. So I like that scene at the high school. It really illustrates how, you know, you mean nothing. You're at the bottom of the pile when you're in high school, and adults can do stuff like that to you, and there is no consequences for them.
Yeah, there's no repercussions. And if I could recommend, since I grew up in a Catholic school system, I will tell you, and I survived the Catholic school system and catechism, I will tell you that my favorite movie as a kid was Heaven Help Us with Kevin McCarthy and Kevin McCarthy. Jeez, it's not Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Andrew McCarthy and Matt Dillon, and it's in a Catholic school in the 60s. And spoilers, some chaos breaks out. Andrew McCarthy decks this monk, this brother that's teaching him history or philosophy in one of the schools, and it happens in front of this entire auditorium during Mass. Actually, it's not an auditorium; it's a church. It happens during Mass, and all the kids lose their minds because they all want to take a shot at this guy. And the manga does that too. Like there's a teacher in the manga who's very similar to this one, and nobody's paying attention to him. You know, they're crushing the pills on the desk and snorting them like in class. It's great. Look at this shot here, this pan back. That's Otomo using his favorite films to construct certain shots that he wants. See, this is right out of the manga.
Yeah, and just the amount of layers too in each shot is you just don't see that a lot in animated films of this time. And yeah, this is around the point in the movie where it starts to split wildly from the manga series. And Tetsuo's descent into madness obviously is a little bit quicker, although ironically it seems like in the manga he becomes evil faster, where in the movie you kind of see the old Tetsuo and his humanity a little bit longer, and Kaneda is fighting for that a little bit longer, where in the manga it's kind of like Tetsuo immediately is overcome with power, and he kills Yamagata, his friend who they mentioned earlier. He kills him in the first volume, and then from that point on, Kaneda is kind of vengeful towards Tetsuo, where in the movie they're kind of more adversaries, more friends until the end.
And look what's happened to Corey here. Corey, who comes in later in the manga, who becomes a hugely influential role. And unfortunately, in the film, I think she shows up for the last 5 minutes just to die. Which I thought, like, what are you supposed to do when you compress like 3,000 pages into 2 hours? You've got to do something. Lady Chiyoko, for example, is completely gone, in my opinion. But the character of Corey, I thought, was just like this very endearing part of Tetsuo's character of trying to relate to something human and trying to figure out what he was dealing with in this adolescence and all these crazy chemicals going on. It was a whole lot deeper, and she added to that deepness to it. And it's unfortunate that we lost her as a character.
Or do we need that? Like, did we need it kind of compressed? Because there did seem to be a lot in the manga that I didn't miss.
One of my favorite podcasts is a podcast called The Rewatchables by Bill Simmons, who's from Boston, actually. And he's heavily into sports. It's theringer.com. You can find all this stuff. But one of his sections was, let's have a discussion over, would this make a better 6-part Netflix series? And with Akira, I would say, maybe if it was 2 parts that were 3 hours, like Akira 1, Akira 2, right? Just condense those first 3 volumes and then condense the last 3 volumes, right? You just call the first one Canada and you call the second one Tetsuo.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I was thinking of if it would make a better TV show, and other than, say, certain shows like Game of Thrones, maybe Lost at a certain time, I found a lot of TV shows struggle to find that movie level budget that you kind of need to pull off a story like this. And I think what they're doing with Dune coming up is that first movie is essentially a part 1. And if it does well successfully, there'll be a part 2. So perhaps I was thinking maybe that could apply to an Akira live action. If they release like a part 1, part 2, and first part's like 3 hours, I don't know. I feel like the cult status is enough where it could make money in the theater.
Yeah, I don't know, though. Like, I'd be interested to hear everybody's thoughts about whether this should ever be turned into live action, because I think it's so...
The answer is yes.
Oh,
the
really?
answer is always yes.
I don't know, because I've completely turned around on adult animation. I used to really not be a fan until I started watching, like, Archer. And I know, which is silly. I love Archer. But I think that there's a lot to be said about what you can do and how you can push the envelope with animation. I think that in itself is a really interesting conversation, because, like, for example, with this, like, you know, maybe I'm just a prude with violence, but I find that I can stomach and analyze the violence a little bit better through animation. So maybe that's just my own opinion, but I just think animation can push conversations and visuals in a different way than live action can. That's just me.
I want a live action everything anime given like a 25-year, right? My only 2 rules, like particularly when it comes to the sex and the violence, it has to be done in a certain way. It has to be shot in a certain respect. You have to respect your actresses that you hire to do something that's so vulnerable as to the person, particularly in a modern era when you know it's not just going to be on disc forever. It's going to be at their fingertips on their phone forever. So whatever that actress is going to do, or whatever that actor is going to do when he's going to cover himself with blood or set himself on fire, or like Tom Cruise hang from an airplane, you know, risking his life, or get kicked in the nads, or cry on screen like Brad Pitt famously did once. And everyone was like, what am I watching? Brad Pitt never cries, right? Whenever you do that, you have to do it in a certain way. You look at this scene here. These are prostitutes. Mm-hmm. You're going to hire, Hollywood has a very checkered history with showing hookers on screen. And one of their favorite motifs is the hooker with the heart of gold. We all know that is not how prostitution works. We all know that it is a sex slave trade that injures millions of people worldwide. And it doesn't do too good of a job to the men that purvey it, right? And how can you show Akira with all of this violence and still get the point across? But more important to me is, how are you going to ask a female to go through that role and do these things that are specifically in the manga to recreate something live action? That to me would be the big challenge. To make it cool, to make it exciting. I go back to Rollerball. Rollerball in the 70s was a great film that had one aspect of that, the brutal violence, which was, hey, this is what we're headed to. Does everybody really want to go this route? When they remade Rollerball, they said this is going to be a hard R. This is going to be full frontal nudity. Rebecca Romaine is going to be in it. The dude from American Pie is going to show his dick, and there's going to be blood everywhere. And I was in. Directed by John McTiernan. I was in. I was told I would have bought that ticket twice, and then I went to go see it, and it was horrible. And they scaled down the violence way much, and they almost cut out all of the nudity. And I'm not saying that was the problem with the film. Clearly, there was a production choice in somebody's office that said, we need to scale all of this back. And that ultimately hurt the vision. And McTiernan just hasn't been the same director since.
Yeah, not even LL Cool J could save that film. And he saves every film he's in. Yeah, no, it'd be interesting for a live action because a lot of the violent events are pretty triggering, especially for modern audiences. I mean, we just watched the theater bombing scene immediately followed by cops with assault rifles mowing down people. I mean, that's a double punch of hot topic triggering events right there. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation. This scene where Kay,
especially,
where Kay kills the cop for the first time. This is different from the manga, and I like this change because in the manga she's already a part of the rebellion. It seems like, but this is kind of her initiation. Yeah, great word. It's like she has a time to sit with like her first kill, and the guy doesn't just die, he drowns in his own blood in sewage with his face half off. I mean, I think that's a great change to her character, and like now you understand based on just her expression that she hasn't killed before, and now she's like, okay, I'm in it,
and the stakes are raised for her.
And now all the chips are on the table. What is she going to do? I mean, if she's ever caught with this crime, et cetera, et cetera. People kind of forget that other societies don't have these Puritan values that we inherited from not just the founding, but from, living 100 years in the Victorian era and America being basically founded as an evangelical society. We've got these mores that just don't apply to other countries. I remember when I was in France on tour and my wife and I were watching TV and they had this, shampoo commercial and there was a woman nude in the shower on TV. Like you could never, ever, 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 ever get away with that. Like they showed half of J-Lo's side and all the world freaked out. Well, all of America freaked out. Like it was crazy. Japan is a much more violent society and Japan has always been torn, particularly in this era. The 80s, people kind of forget. It was only 40 years. 1984 was only 40 years after the war. My grandfather was in his 60s, and he was a combat infantryman in Europe. He had living memory of the war, and he was passing it on to me. Like, imagine in Japan, there were millions of veterans that were still alive in Japan at the time, and most of them had not served against the American army. Most of those guys were dead. The ones that were still alive were the ones that served in China and had committed all kinds of horrible atrocities that they had gotten away with pretty much, right? Like the stuff you did against the Americans, we'll shoot you for that. We'll put you on trial. But if you killed 100,000 Chinese, hey, no one's going to care. And there are mores in Japanese society being very different in TV, in film. If you ever seen Branded to Kill, how they portray the female nude as opposed to the male nude, they stick with these very conventions that strangely enough follow into pornography and hentai and everything else that just makes you want to shake your head. Like, what are you guys doing? The Greeks have been open about this for 2,000 years, right? But to American sensibilities, man, this seems kind of violent, and it just seems kind of there's too much nudity. Like in the beginning in the bar, there's a guy with his hand up this girl's shirt, and she doesn't seem like she's having a good time. This just instantly makes you uncomfortable for a 2-hour screening, right? And I think that shocked a lot of American viewers, but in Japan, it probably wasn't so shocking.
Yeah, that moment when, is it Kay or Corey whose shirt gets ripped through the front? Yeah,
Carrie.
Yeah, that was really intense for me the first time I watched that. And I mean, it still is intense. It still really affects me because they like full on punch her in the mouth. That's really intense. I think you're right. There is a really short hop between the toxic masculinity and the power structure that so quickly shuffles out into this movie, and that like sexual violence. And it's a lot. It's a lot to think about and see visualized on screen too.
And as we go down into the depths, just to find number 28, I want to bring up one of the most famous movies of all time, which I think about it every time I watch Akira. Can you guess which movie? I'll give you one shot. 3, 2, 1. Jaws. Where is Akira? For this whole film, where is Akira? And where is he in the manga? He doesn't show up in the manga until like the end of part 3? The end of 2?
Yeah.
Akira is the shark in Jaws. He's Bruce.
Yes, gotcha. That's really smart. I did not think about that.
There's this scene by scene build. Okay, first of all, I was confused the first time I rented this on home video and took it home, and it was who's this Canada guy? Where's Akira? Is his name Akira? He's on the cover. This must be Akira with the bike. No, that's not it at all. Right?
Yeah.
This is complete switcheroo. And then at the ending for him to show up for basically a minute. And this is just as straight out of The Third Man, where we're talking about Harry Lime for 45 minutes. The dude doesn't show up until like the 5th reel.
Mm-hmm.
And then Harry Lime hits.
Yeah, I was thinking too, we talked a lot about how there are a lot of influences on Stranger Things from Akira. And that's very similar to 11, because I don't think that we get to the research facility until halfway through episode 1 or season 1. And then we finally meet 11 and it's like, wait a second, who is this? What's going on here? Yeah, it's very similar.
But that goes back to Otomo's very unique view of timing. So Otomo had a cinematic mind even when he was doing this stuff in the 70s. So he tried to pace the amount of time that you spent reading each panel of the manga, even if you were just flipping through it. And when he filmed this, he kept the same timing that he went from scene by scene. They only need so many seconds to see this. They only need so many seconds to see this. They only need so many seconds to see this. That never left his head. And he is deliberately building scene after scene. It's cold. We have to keep it cold. We have to keep it down in the earth. We have to keep it dark. We have to keep it away from people. We have to keep it away from everybody, and nobody can know about this. And you only get that sense after 15 minutes of screen time of him very deliberately showing you that what's going on. And everyone is concerned about it cold. Everyone is concerned about the cryogenics. Why is it? And he just hits that theme, and he hits it hard. And then he shows you this. And by this point, if you're not in the movie, I don't know what to say.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm lost. You've had biker gangs. You've had extreme violence. You've had supernatural occurrences. You've got some weird kids running around. If you're not sold by this point, then you're just, I can't help you. And great artwork, by the way, not just by Otomo, Yasumitsu Satake, Makoto Shiosaki, Satoshi Takatanabe, and Satoshi Kon. So Satoshi Kon was also the director. He directed Perfect Blue, Millennium Actress, Tokyo Godfathers, and Paranoia Agent. All of those were huge hits. Not as big as Akira, but they were huge hits.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say, I think we talked about this in our episode as well, but the ability for an artist to go from their own still work and bring it to life on the screen must have been absolutely beautiful. And I think that Otomo colored some of his manga, but not for the original books. We have it in black and white. And so for me to go from that to the screen and sort of see how much of this was Otomo's baby, you can see that, you were talking about things as subtle as someone adjusting their shoulders. That's a very intentional choice. And they put so much work into this because it meant so much to that team, I think. And you can just see it all over this piece. It's just beautiful.
Well, I've got the budget here somewhere. The budget for this was not outrageous. So this is what gets me. Okay. Akira's budget was not outrageous. Akira is the most popular manga from Japan worldwide. But in Japan, if you actually look at what is the most popular there, it's not Akira. Akira's in the top 10. People are constantly pointing out Howl's Moving Castle or Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind as number 1 or number 2. Akira is always 5 or 9 or something. But there's a very obvious shift in Japanese expectations. But if you ask anybody in France, what's the famous Japanimation film, they're going to say Akira. I'll try to find the budget. I wrote it down here somewhere.
It was 10 million.
10 million?
That's what I thought it was.
So putting this into perspective, okay, because I'm going to shock you with a fact after I read this 300-page about DreamWorks Studios, which blew my mind. Shrek, the first film, will never be paid off. Let me say that again. Shrek, as a film, was so expensive, it will never be paid off. It was Katzenberg throwing money into a toilet and flushing it for 7 years. The reason DreamWorks has shut down and sold off their innovation division here and their live studio division here and their licensing over here is because they never got out of the Shrek hole. They made an enormous amount of money with Shrek 2 that disappeared into the hole of Shrek 1.
Get out of here.
Stealing all the artists from Disney, setting up places to put them to. It just skyrocketing costs and reprogramming everything to get certain scenes out. Re-recording the lead actor 3 times, who wanted 3 times the fee. Well, if you want me to do it again, I'll do it again, but I'm not going to spend 6 weeks here and not get paid. Yes. Who recorded it, and they set it aside because they didn't think that it fit. And then Mike Myers did it. He got paid once, and then they said, this isn't working. And he said, well, how about I do it like my dad in a Canadian Scottish accent? That's not going to work. Well, let me show you. And he got paid again.
Wow. I didn't know he'd been paid twice. That's insane.
So all of those costs add up. Now, I don't know how much he was paid, but Mike Myers in the late 90s, can you imagine? It was probably close to $350,000. So you spend $1 million on an audio actor? Like this is insane.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, Matt Damon did Titan AE, I think, for like $50,000. Because it was a week's worth of his work.
Did he really?
Yeah. It was very cheap. Titan AE was very cheap, despite the impact that it had.
Yeah.
Love that. I love that movie.
Yeah, I love it too. I have a soft place in my heart for Treasure Planet.
Oh, yeah.
Me too. I saw that as a youngin' on my birthday. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an unsung classic. I think another one of those, is Atlantis. I love that movie. And I feel like that's never... Oh, really? Oh, that's another one that I think is wonderful. But
yeah, we could go on a whole separate...
Yeah, we can go on.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should talk about this scene.
The first print of the Takamon was 300,000 pages when it was sold. And one copy was 100,000 yen. So, yes. Okay. So this scene right here is right out of Dr. Strangelove. You've got the circular table. You've got the light above it. This is the war room. This guy here on the right with the Hitler stash, that's George C. Scott. Mm-hmm. You've got the president here who was played by Peter Sellers. And you've got this whole ring of people who always know better. And the colonel is trapped. And there's a guy in the Strangelove there's the president there on the left. Looks like Peter Sellers. This entire scene is very constructed to look exactly like that Kubrickian nightmare, which is you cannot fight in the war room. And what are they doing right here? They're fighting in the war room. The only thing missing out of this scene is the Russian ambassador in a pie fight. Oh, yes. Well, like I say, little things coming out of big men and big things coming out of little men. Mm-hmm. Right? There's an inverse reaction. And Nezu, just the corrupt, ultra-corrupt official, right, who actually I just found in the manga just entirely fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that religious
this is a Blade Runner
subplot. Oh, yeah.
Blade Runner.
Yeah.
Right out of Blade
Such
Runner.
a Blade Runner shot. I was just going to say that.
Yeah, especially 2049 with Jared Leto's compound.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even the color scheme in that shot is with like the ambers and the oranges and the hues is a direct lift by 2049 from that.
And this scene, Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe this scene is in the manga where the Espers attack Tetsuo with their telekinesis, like making the bear.
This whole scene I found just extraordinarily confusing the first time I watched it. And and you have to give people a lot of leeway when they watch Akira the first time. It is so strange.
This scene, yeah, I agree.
I mean, it's not like Spirited Away or anything, but there are things going on that people are just not going to catch on the first time. I was actually like, what is actually happening in Tetsuo's room? I don't particularly get it. And even when I think, is it Masuro who's putting the big bad bear together, and they're trying to intimidate Tetsuo. Even when it's revealed that the man behind the curtain is this small aged child, I didn't particularly get it all the way. The telekinesis wasn't as obvious to me. It took repetitive viewings, and definitely in the manga, it comes across way better.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And they blow out in the manga. They really get into with a very important character that is shown on screen, I think twice, very briefly, both times. And we almost are led to think that the character is male, but it's Lady Miyako, who plays an immense role in the development of Tetsuo towards the latter third of the manga. But in terms of the powers, who the espers are, what the telekinesis is, you get a vastly more detailed understanding as to where it's coming from, why they're trying to understand it, who's been involved with kind of the government research projects in the past. And they also go into the pills much more. They almost don't even touch it really from an explanatory sense in the film, but in the manga, they, through Lady Miyako and Tetsuo's interactions, you come to understand what the pills are and what they do and how they affect kind of the development of these powers in the subjects that are taking them.
Well, they're inhibiting him, aren't they, Ryan? The pills, the capsules. They are in one way, I think, allowing him to cope with the onset of the powers. But if they're taken in a certain amount, they speed it up, and it's almost it almost becomes like a drug to him. There's several scenes, I think, in the manga where he's just got buckets. Oh, he's like Tony Montana on the big desk full of Coke, or my favorite scene out of the Queen's Gambit when she takes the whole jar of the tranquilizers, right?
And Lady Miyako warns him in the manga about abusing the pills and what they're going to do to speeding up basically, the development of these powers and how quickly it can get out of control. There are ways in which it's kind of helping him in certain amounts, and when it's abused, it kind of lets everything kind of get out of control. So
I finally found the card. Akira grossed 6 times its budget and made 7 billion yen. Yeah. Oh, mine too. Yeah. And no, they're not dropping that price for anybody. They don't care what the price is. I just got yesterday on Blu-ray on Amazon for like $6. Mm-hmm. I was like, this is unfair. This is a Danny Boyle movie. It came out last year and it's $6. I'm definitely getting it. I'm not complaining, but this is wrong. And then when I went to go buy Akira last month, they're like, oh my God, really?
Right. Yep.
Look at Dune right now. Somebody has Arrow, I think, just put out the long version of Dune in '84. And that's like $40.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's crazy.
That's crazy.
So this scene coming up right here, when I was a kid, the first time I saw this was the point for me that blew my mind, was just right here. Yeah. And I remember like staring at the TV, and right here when it shows the carnage up close and everything dripping and falling from the ceilings was, I don't think that at the time I thought anything like, oh, this is an action movie, this is cool. I was more shocked and just aghast at what, when I was a kid thinking a cartoon, because I didn't have any understanding as to what this was. I just, it's animated. It must, I guess I slapped the cartoon label on it, but it was this just kind of shift in perspective as in my view of animation, just with all the violence and the, I guess that was a shot of gore for sure. But when I was a kid, that was one of the most impactful moments of the entire film for me. Just realizing I was watching something different than what I thought I was watching, I think.
To a child a teenager not understanding their power and having it explode from within them. Like, that has real consequences.
Yeah, and this isn't exactly a hot take, but we're both big Stranger Things fans. And especially season 1 has direct shots of Eleven in the hallway dealing with the evil scientists. And again, I'm not saying that Stranger Things is bad or they fully ripped off Akira, but they owe a lot of their inspiration from that famous green hallway scene.
I think going back to the conversation about what you can do with animation, like, I think Stranger Things could never have done that kind of gore. And I think as much as I am uncomfortable with it, because it's scary to think about people like getting, blown into little bits that fall off the ceiling, like that, there are stakes in here that I just don't know if you could do or give or get as much out of that if you did it in live action. But I don't know. It'd have to be like rated R.
Right.
Maybe.
Well, there was supposed to be a rating for that, NC-17. And 1/4 of all films coming out of Hollywood were supposed to be hit with that label, so it was not a stigmata. And that absolutely failed to cause a dent.
Well, and we just watched Handmaiden, which is a beautiful movie, but that's still unrated in the States because of the, I guess, sexual violence. But I think there are ways to do it, I guess. Do it right.
Yeah, Lustmord is what the Germans say. Sexual violence. They actually have a word for it. I know that shocks everybody. The Germans have a word for something disgusting. Sexual murder. Yeah.
I'm surprised it's not a longer word.
Yeah. No, that's also true. The turning point in the hallway, there's several things going on all in one moment. It's a turning point for Tetsuo. Now he's a murderer. And actually now is the point in the film where I lose all sympathy for him, and he is now a villain. Whereas in the manga, he's able to carry out this duality for actually quite a long time, and particularly when Corey comes into the picture in Volume 5 and Volume 6, and she escapes being a victim. Well, she's a victim of his anyway. She's his sexual slave to begin with. But when he basically intends to kill her, and when she escapes out of that, it's almost like the cleverness, like he respects the fact that she's not like the others, like she's smarter, she's ahead of the pack, and therefore she turns into almost like this maternal figure to try to take care of him, and that elicited more sympathy for his character until the very end, where I just could not wait for someone, please get rid of Tetsuo. I'm tired of, why is Akira just letting him continue on like this, right? If he is so all powerful. But Akira is ambivalent. Akira just wants to play with rocks. He's a child. All these grown-up games, these things don't concern me, right? You do it because you can't hurt me anyway, right? So you just go ahead and you play your little biker games and you argue over girls and do all that stuff and you take your drugs. I don't care. I'm going to continue playing with my rocks. Until you start disturbing my universe, that's when I'm going to crush you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it's kind of the difference between people who are fighting for power, but like they'll never have it or they don't deserve it, versus someone who has all the power and can just sort of point a finger and say like, I don't like this, zap.
The scene we just watched, I noticed that the Darth Vader scene in Rogue One looked very similar to that, of just an imposing force at one end of a red hallway mowing down people at the other. It looked Rogue One took direct inspiration.
You just made me very happy, Danny. Rogue One reference.
Yeah,
I just, to Laura, to your point in terms of struggle for power, I was thinking about this, and like I remember on your podcast when we did Akira, about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago. I mentioned that every time I watch this, I see something that I didn't see before. And Dylan, when you were talking about the descent into the kind of cryogenics laboratory, I always remark to myself about the view of, when you're looking, when you think you're going to look at like a freezer, basically like a nice organized kind of like locker where all these things are stored, or whatever you value is in there that you're keeping away preserved. And it's just basically a door with, it looks like over time, they've just struggled to, in a very disorganized way, patch on tubes and plates and vents and cooling lines into this kind of monstrosity that just has grown out. And it looks so disorganized. It just looks haphazard, almost like they're just scrambling to add on bits and pieces to keep this thing stable. And to me, through this conversation, I was like, that's a kind of a metaphor for struggle for power throughout this whole thing, especially from like an authoritarian or an authority struggling for power over something that they do not understand and doing everything they can to try to control it. And it shows how unsuccessful they are, because that disorganization makes you think about, okay, well, what's going wrong here? What are they not doing right? And I just think it's a great shot every time we see it. And it's almost referenced, in the war room with the round table and how everything is just kind of, the papers are everywhere. Everybody's screaming. It's frenetic and chaotic. And it's almost like those two kind of coexist as a reference to the same thing, because they're both basically commenting on the same thing.
Yeah. And at the same time, there's a dichotomy going on. All the adults do is talk, and the kids, they do. Right. The kids are fighting right now in a playroom, and the adults were in a war room, and they're just shouting at each other.
Yeah. I wanted to mention the difference in animation with the kids area with that castle, and we saw it earlier, but there's a shot of a sort of stone engraving, which has like Sleeping Beauty and the Seven Dwarves, I think, kind of around her. And even with the toys too, it's so interesting to watch how Otomo's kind of pointing a finger at Disney and saying like, this is what you do. And like, this is not as good as what I do. Cause those just look very caricature-y and kind of googie. And I think it's just fun to see that. I feel like that was like maybe a little poke at Disney. Like, you're not as good as me.
Well, I think that's true. Cool. I saw it as kind of like a comment on, castles are typically in film considered conservative bastions.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And, and in here, there's obviously the Sleeping Beauty reference because who's the Sleeping Beauty in this case? It's Akira.
Yeah.
Right. So I think all three of those interpretations have room. And to think that Otomo, particularly, I'm not familiar with his other work, but when I read the manga and I watch the film, he's very much like Kubrick, and then I would say David Fincher in that case of, if he cared to put it in your vision,
yes,
it was for a reason.
Right.
Absolutely. Like even those little hearts on the castle flags, you look at that and you're like, this is such a different space. Like I think it sets up the children spaces very differently and very well.
I love this shot right here with the turret from the sled bobbing in and out of the frontal kind of shot of Kaneda and Kay.
There's real danger.
Yeah.
There's real palpable danger going on.
He just flips it real quick, and you're staring down the barrel of a 3-barrel minigun, and it's glaring.
To bring up Star Wars again, what they're riding very similar to Return of the Jedi, and
yeah.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, the manga the first volume came out before Return of the Jedi. Return of the Jedi was 1983, so I think those copters predate Return of the Jedi.
That's interesting.
And there's a backdrop in the playroom where you saw it very briefly. It might show up again. It looks like Bespin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It is a sci-fi Cloud City type of thing. And Otomo said, if you want to be a great manga artist, don't read manga. Watch first-rate films, listen to first-rate music, and read first-rate books. I'm sure the Japanese for first-rate is different.
Sure. Yeah, I read that he was a fan growing up of manga, and he just changed. He wanted his style to be more illustrative. And I mean, I haven't read a lot of manga, but again, I think this style is just so particular.
He had 70 animators work on this. They had 327 colors.
Wow.
327 colors. Like I think the most colors pre-Akira is like 150 or something like that.
I sometimes watch and try to figure out what kind of colors are particular to this movie. Out of curiosity too, I actually Googled how much an original 1988 cell would cost to purchase from the movie. And they range anywhere from $6,000 to like $15,000 up, which I think is pretty cool. I've looked into different cells for myself because I kind of grew up being a Scooby-Doo fan. So I've always wanted one of those original Hanna-Barbera cells to put on my wall, but those are also just so expensive. But wouldn't it be incredible to have one of these on your wall?
You just made that a life goal of mine. I didn't even know that.
Shaggy running forever and ever and ever.
It's just one of those things. Like I've had that on my, if I ever have $1 million, that's like one of the first things that I'm going to buy. And, cells are priced based on the still that what was going on during the movie. So if it's a more pivotal scene, that cell will be more expensive, or if it's an iconic clip of something, it'll be more expensive. And I was looking at some of these and like, there are some really cool ones for sale.
Oh, yeah. Instead of saving up for a wedding, how about let's funnel our funds to that? Because that sounds cooler.
Yeah.
So if you ever get a chance, episode 333 on the Projection Booth podcast with Mike White, who we were talking about earlier, he brought on Jonathan Clements, who's author of Anime A History, and they spoke for about an hour, and he addressed that very topic about how they chopped up a lot of the celluloid that came to the United States, and they were going to give it away effectively. Like if you bought a manga book at a Comic-Con, then they were going to give you a cell of Akira.
What?
Because Akira had opened in, a normal theater release back then, 5,000 theaters, 7,000 was a lot. Most were 3,000 to 5,000. And really for Akira, like I think they ran 500 or 1,000. So there were not that many copies. But instead what these people were doing was instantly framing them and then selling them.
Of course.
Instantly selling them for $300 and $500. And the stupid people in Hollywood who decided to do this, the distributors, they're like, oh, we lost out on millions of dollars of revenue. And that changed everything. Then after that, Disney was like, what do we have around here
of course.
that we can, because today, for example, we mentioned before the podcast about how I went to go see Harry Potter 7 Part 1, right? That film does not exist on film. It was shot on digital. The president of Warner Brothers went to a party in Beverly Hills and met Quentin Tarantino. They knew each other, and they talked about Harry Potter. And Tarantino said, I want to show that at the New Beverly. And the guy said, okay, great. I will give you one as a gift. And it cost Warner Brothers $50,000 to print that onto celluloid just so Tarantino could show it 3 times.
Oh, my God.
At a complete loss.
Yeah.
Right. That's one of the reasons why I was there. And just think about how many frames that you have. We already know that a 2-hour movie is going to have, what did I say, 172,000 frames, right? And chopping those up and you selling them for $500, like that is a business in of itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I feel like with the recent resurgence in boutique stores like Etsy, boutique online stores, I feel like Akira anything would make a killing there. It currently is. And Ryan brought this up in our episode, but this film just keeps on cycling through every 10 years, a kind of a cultural resurgence. Like, in the early 2000s, it was like Kanye West with his music video with showing the green hallway. And then just recently with like Ready Player One with the bike that Olivia Wilde rides, or not Olivia Wilde, excuse me.
Olivia
Wilde's in Tron.
Yes, yeah, I'm mixing up, but
that's
Olivia,
okay.
Olivia, she's in Thoroughbreds. Yeah, that actress. But anyways, yeah, this movie just keeps on cycling through generation.
And she played Artemis.
Yes, yeah.
And she rode Akira's bike in Ready Player One.
You know, going back to the live action discussion and to the point of this kind of coming in waves culturally, you know, every few years or so, I think that, I mean, there's been times where I've seen, you know, something that's been reworked or a live action version of something that I'm like, oh, and then I find out it was adapted from something, or there was a previous version. I mean, I think if this were, you know, fingers crossed, one day we'll get it. But if a live action version were to come out, it would open it up to several generations of people that might not even be aware that it was a film or an animation from the 80s, and that this is, an adaptation or just a remake, and that in turn just gets the original work so much more exposure, and then will give the original manga so much more exposure too. So I think that I can't really argue against that for myself. I think that would be valid reason enough to make a live action remake of this, just to bring awareness into what Akira is to a much wider swath of people.
Well, there's two sides to that, right? There's, like, quite frankly, I could do without most of these Disney live action remakes. Like, I really think that they're enormous cash grabs.
Yeah.
Like, I saw the Jungle Book, and the Jungle Book was really impressive, and I don't want to besmirch the image of Jon Favreau in any way, but I could have done without that movie. Right. And I don't think that it added anything to what we had to say. And if we're going to do the same thing with some of these animes, and we'll take Ghost in the Shell to your point, Ghost in the Shell had an enormous impact in people who were not exposed to the manga. So it drove people back to go to the manga. And what you find is the people that like that Johansson version are also fans of the manga, but not vice versa. I'm like the only standout. I'm the only one who read Ghost in the Shell 25 years ago and like the live action. I've never met anyone else who can, has that. But I also prefer the remake of Total Recall. So we already know that I'm a weird bird.
Interesting.
Right? I don't care for the first one at all. So although I'm against, in general, live shooting any anime, I want to preface that by saying that if you're going to do it, go all the way. Make Akira a hard R. And make your point about Japanese society. This society in the 1980s was torn apart. People kind of forget that the militarism that was ruling the country and the oligarchy that was in charge in the 1940s, it wasn't totally gone. It was kind of like Germany and the Federal Republic in the post-war period still had Nazis running companies like Mercedes-Benz, who were in charge of labor unions. All of that was still going on. And in the 60s and 70s were all of these kids who finally just woke up and said, Mom and Dad, what did you do during the war? And they didn't like the answer. And I think what you have is this cultural revolution that's happening in animation, paralleling it. It's going at the same time as these kids who are asking these very real questions about violence, about sex, about morality. And you just have this cross-pollination, if I could use that word. It just happens in parallel at the same time. And he's commenting on a lot of that. And everybody kind of forgets now, of course, Americans have no fucking clue. We forced Japan to sign a treaty in 1951 that said, you will be our friend. You don't have a choice. You have to do what we say. And then that treaty was renewed in 1960. It said, not only does the first treaty really apply, but now you have to like it. And then it was up for renewal again in 1970. And that's what a lot of the riots in 68 and 70 were, all of the kids saying, we are not signing this damn treaty again. And they did. And it was for life. And the only modifications for the 1970 treaty have been made is, okay, you can have a defense force now. That's pretty much it. And the trauma of not being able to have your own military to defend yourself in any given situation. We did the same thing to Germany, except for when it suited us. Like, oh, Germany can have an army. As long as we think the Russians are a problem, then Germany can have an army. Well, are you kidding me? They're going to be staffed with Nazis because that's the only experienced people we have around. Oh, well, you have to make some compromises. If you want to make an omelet, you got to break an eggs type of scenario. It was the same way in Japan. You got to keep the telephones working. So what if that guy murdered 300,000 Chinese?
Yeah, and during the 80s, you see a lot of works depicting kind of the generational trauma of past wars, or like the wars of your mothers and fathers. Like Watchmen came out around the same time as this, deals with the same exact topic of, in the past there was a thing, an event that happened that now collectively we're all dealing with, like a war. But in Watchmen, it was a manipulated mass explosion over a course of certain cities. And especially the TV show Watchmen and this Akira deals with then the metaphorical fallout of that, which is the next generation of people now having to deal with that, with everyone who initially dealt with that is now either dead or they can't provide a meaningful answer. So you're kind of stuck in this apocalypse.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really insightful, because you're right. Like the violence, the cycle of violence, like you just talked about when the movie opens with the explosion, and how that's also how it ends. And how, like, if we can't move past the emotional trauma of stuff like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and all of the fallout from World War II, like, how do we emotionally process that, and how do we make sure that it doesn't repeat itself? Like, I think that moving on is a really, like, sort of informative idea in this whole movie. Yeah,
and it was the 80s, so the Cold War was still going on at that point, and that it wasn't, I would say, the height of it, of tensions, but certainly that was on the collective consciousness.
Of course, yeah. How are we not going to repeat another?
And there was an active Japanese Communist Party during the entire length of the Cold War. No, all of that is relevant. Absolutely. You dumb bastard is one of my favorite. Apparently that is not in the original Japanese, the you dumb bastard. There's a few things that are kind of off, to no one's surprise. So teleportation is now added to the list of skill sets if you're in the espers. But what's kind of not clear in the film, which is very clear in the manga, is that Kei is being used by the espers to spy on what's going on with Canada and Tetsuo, and she is being deliberately manipulated to try to solve this problem with Tetsuo.
This was another one of my favorite aspects of the manga, and now the movie. Oh, we're getting one of the most iconic shots coming.
That's Terminator 2.
100%.
Yeah. I was saying one of my favorite aspects is, the espers controlling another person. And just recently, Laura and I read Dr. Sleep, which is very similar in that the sequel to The Shining. We actually really liked it. It seems kind of like a hot take. Dr. Sleep doesn't seem that well regarded, the book at least. But there's something so fascinating to me about someone with telepathy controlling someone else, because it is like a complete and total like violation of your mental space that you can't even comprehend. It really fascinates me.
When you hear that all the time in the X-Men films with Jean Grey, like, did you just read my mind without my permission?
Yeah.
That's in the Dark Phoenix, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens in Dr. Sleep. There's a young girl who's able to like astral project her mental everything into other people, or into specifically people who have the Shining. But yeah, very
No,
similar.
I read Dr. Sleep when I was on my Stephen King kick, and I mean that's an exceptional book. That's one of his best books.
Thank you.
I don't want to get too far away from Akira, but I was dragging my feet going into that because The Shining is one of my absolute favorite books. So the first 100 pages, I was like, I don't want to read this. And then I was like, God damn it, Stephen King has done it again. he hooked me, and I love this book, and I read it in like a week, and it's 600 plus pages. So it's going to
go on my long list of things we have to discuss on the special report.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's such a good book.
783 scenes in Akira, and the entire film was pre-recorded. So they recorded the voice.
I read that. Yeah, that's really interesting. I read that that's more of an American style of animated features, and usually in
yes, and do you
anime,
know why?
it's the other way around. I don't know why.
Because Disney found out that it was driving audiences crazy that the mouth was not matching the words.
Yeah.
And when they drew Akira, Otomo was very careful of this has to match, never thinking this is going to be translated and dubbed in English, and it's not going to match anyway, right? Because the Japanese market is only like 20% of the people who are buying Akira.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter. It matches in Japanese.
Yeah. And here's the iconic Ohashi score and Tetsuo emerging from the fire. Just the score. I mean, one of the all-time greats, in my opinion. So
intense. And this is where he gets his cape. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's from this point on, the movie is it's iconic to begin with, but now this is kind of an extended fight scene all the way to the end, and it is just breathtaking.
Well, this is the Matrix. Shell coming and stopping, and the whole situation, and a little bit of Iron Man at the same time, and a
little bit of The Incredibles
and the Chronicles, and it really is a film it's really quite forward. Yeah. And as far as having sympathy with a lot of the writers and showing the different sides of what's going on. And then there's a coup going on at the same time that everybody just kind of forgets about. And the manga, the coup is hugely important to what's going on.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this earlier and I kind of lost my train of thought, but the religious subplot is pretty fully taken out of the anime. That's not really discussed at all, but it's something that I found interesting in the manga, because when you have kind of a falling apart of society, religion is something that'll very quickly filter to the top. And so I thought it was a really good addition, a really interesting addition, because I think religion is interesting. I'm an atheist, but I think it's interesting to study and just see how it affects people who are going through a crisis.
Yeah, agreed. It was a tad disappointing to see that, having read the manga, then to see that fully removed from the film. And I think also this subplot with Nezu, perhaps not given the time of day to properly resonate in the film.
Mm-hmm. Maybe something if they created an expanded series that this could be dug into a little deeper.
It's really hard to ignore that, particularly in Japanese society, which is so heavily Shinto and Buddhist and so forth, not so much Taoist. But you can't separate that from, the religion in Japan, it's more like a way of life. It's not really a religion. A lot of people, a lot of Americans can turn on their religion on Sunday and then they can turn it off. Or like we used to say, they're cafeteria Catholics. They believe in abortion, stuff like that. You can take what you want and you can leave the rest. And in the East, it's not really, it's more pliable, it's more flexible, but it's in everyday life and it's in everything that you see. And the religious aspect, particularly in the latter half of the manga, when Akira becomes this godlike figure, and literally the Tankobon 4 has him like on the throne, right, with a scepter. It's really quite crazy. But, separating religion from anything is going to be extraordinarily difficult.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another iconic scene, I think, is that on the cover? When he's in front of the...
Oh, the cover's when he's...
Essentially, the shot, he's kind of sitting in its side profile.
And to give you an idea of how popular animated films were in the 1970s, there were 49 animated films in Japan between 1970 and 1979.
Wow.
1980 and 1989, there were 220. There's a 5-fold increase. And if you included shorts in the 90s, it would quintuple again.
Wow.
There's Lady Miyako.
Yeah.
Who, voiced by a man.
Well, right.
Fear not. So this really, this is kind of crazy. I don't know if you've seen Contact with Jodie Foster.
Mm-hmm.
But there's that scene where she's driving through the desert to get back to the satellites, and now the word is out that they've received this image, and this image is from outer spaces of who? It's of Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
So the entire desert is full of neo-Nazis and atheists and people having arguments that have nothing to do with what's actually going on. And I saw the riot that Otomo put in, particularly in the film, of this riot of these people who don't actually know what's going on. They just have a clique or a point of view, or they belong to a subset that has an agenda that nobody really cares about. It actually kind of reminded me, I think it was around 2003. It was right before we invaded Iraq. There was this enormous peace protest in San Francisco that went on a whole weekend, and it made national news across the country. And it was the most insane thing I'd ever seen. There were anti-Semites there. There were people who were obviously just hated Bush. There was a true democratic movement there. And then there were just like wackos who just wanted to legalize weed. And this was, 18 years ago. It's like, what is going on? And Bill Maher, actually, I don't like Bill Maher, but he actually made fun of it. What do we want? We don't know. When do we want it? As soon as we can figure out what it is, the hell do we want?
Yeah. That was a criticism of the 1% movement out here too. Like, there were a lot of people who were criticizing rich people, but there wasn't a call for anything. And so that disbanded really quickly, because it was like, if you don't have demands and you don't have a way to further those demands, then you're just people sitting outside.
Well, you could almost say the same thing about what's going on here. These people are rioting. Why? And there's a coup. Why? And you don't even have the idea of, are they for the coup or against the coup? They're just out there rioting. Now, this is the first time a computer was used to create an animation in a cartoon film.
Ooh, interesting.
With the energy field.
Right, and that's the scientist character is a character who survives the first act in the movie, but in the series, he's killed off in the end of volume 2. So that's an interesting. They kind of front loaded. Ryan brought this up in our episode, but they front loaded a lot of character to the scientist and added, and then I think just out of time they couldn't put in that religious subplot. So that's why Lady Miyako is, I guess, you could argue that it's like character assassination, but it's like more of a function of just time. So they removed her character, but expanded the scientist.
And that enormous door that opens kind of reminds me of War Games when they go into the bunker at NORAD. Go ahead, Ryan.
The scientist's importance in the film is very present, and it is in the manga too. But the frames in which he perishes are some of the most striking to me in the first part of the series. There's an issue with closing or getting out of the cryogenic kind of area before a big locking door shuts, and he gets caught in the cold without his proper equipment, and he's like instantly frozen solid in this laboratory. And it's just it's a striking, I can still see it. I can't remember which volume it's in, but it's just interesting in terms of, stark differences between the film and the manga, but it's also a really kind of striking point in the manga too, just seeing his arc kind of come in and be very heavy, but also quickly fade out pretty fast.
That reminds me of the freezing laboratory in Blade Runner.
Yes, the eye
design.
Yeah.
With James Hong.
Yeah, really similar.
Yeah.
But yeah, the scientist dying in the manga had kind of a Game of Thrones effect. We were like, oh, okay, anyone can die at any minute.
Yeah, we haven't talked about the general, really. How he's kind of pulled between a bunch of, I guess, political parties and obligations and...
Well, he got tired of the pencil pushers arguing all the time and not taking what was happening very seriously. So he decided to throw a coup, push Nezu out of power, who was basically the prime minister, and then take charge of the situation so that he could suppress Akira himself. Instead of waiting for their decision, he was just going to do it himself, and so that he could save the day. Now, what his plan was after that, I don't know. He had to have known, like, I could do this, and even if I save the day, I could still just go to jail, right? But to him, it was worth it.
Right. That was my quote in the beginning. It's like, my job isn't to believe or not believe; it's to act or not act. Right.
Right.
Something that rising kind of globe reminds me of is Krang in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I mean, it's kind of a stretch reference, but just his, like the dome that travels around in that series.
And kind of the wires that are trailing off. And yeah, it's very clunky in that sense.
Also very Incredibles. Like the robot at the end of that movie. But that's also a little bit of stretch.
There was a parallel that I saw of, they're having the Olympics in Tokyo, in the manga and in the film, and of course we just had the Olympics in Tokyo, and it was almost a disaster.
Right.
I mean, there were clearly things that I wouldn't say it was as big as a disaster as what happened in Athens or Sochi, but the Japanese managed to pull it off without having it completely embarrass everything that had ever happened, but. In this situation, they're specifically building the Olympic compound on what's left of bombed out Tokyo from this event that happened in 1988. And that's actually where they're keeping Akira in some sort of cryogenic sedated state. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen the Tokyo Olympiad, which is on the Criterion Collection. It is the commissioned film from the Tokyo Olympics of 1960. And in a way, it's the last important Olympics because it's the last Olympics that we had in which nobody really talked about politics. Every Olympics thereafter, there was a massacre, there was a shooting, or there was a hostage crisis, or what country are you holding in, or how much is this costing, or et cetera. But in 1960, Tokyo won the Olympic bid 6 years before that, and they cleared entire neighborhoods in Tokyo that had been bombed out from the war.
Wow.
And they got this infusion of cash from, you guessed it, the Americans, to build this enormous complex. And they were using it very specifically to regenerate a part of the city that they just simply did not have the capital to do. And it worked out extremely well for them. And it was this enormous success. And they addressed that in the film. Actually, the first shot of the Tokyo Olympiad is these old buildings that you can tell are bombed out being knocked down and bulldozed over, and this new beautiful thing going in its place.
It's really interesting you bring this up because we talked about, or we touched on a little bit of Japanese history in our episode about Handmaiden, because Japanese culture was so heavily influenced by Western cultures. But when I was doing research about Akira, it talked about how in the 80s, Japan was trying to expand their going back to their cultural roots and trying to figure out, like, how are we not, westernized? How are we as a country and as a people, especially following World War II, and how this movie kind of set off like a metaphorical bomb of how kind of expanding, like, this is Japan and this is Japanese culture. And so those, like, the setup for that is how heavily influenced the West was, and how now, like, in the 80s, it's transitioning to be like a fully Japanese influence kind of coming out of Japan.
Yeah. And here with the jars we've discovered Akira now. Akira's
Yeah.
arts. And this is what I would call, particularly if you watch this for the first time, probably the biggest letdown. Right?
It absolutely knocked me on my butt the first time I watched it. I'm so happy I read the manga first, where Akira is such a prominent figure at the end of volume 2 forward. And to go into this movie not knowing this quote unquote twist, it is, I can't think of a time where I so viscerally feel the disappointment that a character is feeling, because like Tetsuo, we the viewer are just waiting and waiting and waiting to see Akira, and Tetsuo has a literal link to him. To then get to that point is just such a jarring, like you said, and monumental letdown. In the good way. Like, I'm not saying like it's bad.
You totally empathize with the character.
Yeah. It's a way to get back onto Tetsuo's side, in a sense, after he's killed some people, at least momentarily.
And at the same time, there's something else going on. I don't know if Otomo was doing this deliberately, but you guys know about Unit 731. It's the secret Japanese unit that operated in China in 1932 to 1945, in which they were experimenting on live patients in concentration camps. It was basically it's the same thing Mengele and the Nazis were doing in Auschwitz, only on a much larger scale. There were tens of thousands of patients, and none of them survived. But they kept very meticulous paperwork. In a lot of cases, they were live vivisecting people.
Oh my God!
And some of the stuff they were doing was so absolutely horrible, removing organs from a live host to preserve them at the very last minute in jars like this. So I found a direct correlation. I mean, 731 is like one of the nastiest things that have ever happened in the history of mankind. And it is not very well known or talked about in Japan. And there is a large reaction to pretty much anything that has any type of criticism, like the book, The Rape of Nanking, that came out. It wasn't even published in Japan. They couldn't find a Japanese publisher who would touch it, right? The only copy you could get was in English if you had it shipped in. Of course, you had to know English in order to read it, by Iris Chang. So 731 is not a popular topic. And it's the same thing in America. I mentioned before that we are pretty self-reflexive when it comes to cinema. So, Americans are very, very bad even today, even recently, about talking about the sins of our nation, whether it be the removal of the Native Americans or the genocide of the Native Americans or the slavery that happened in antebellum, or how we've been treating, half of our population under a certain economic strata forever. We're just not very good at talking about that on a national scale, except using cinema. And again, you may not hit you when you go see it. I mean, are most Americans who go see Black Panther really understand why he is a focus point of power? Probably not.
Yeah, I think we both agree that was the brilliance of Watchmen, because I think it didn't treat the audience like an idiot and like really hit it over the head, but wasn't oppressive about like, this is about slavery and the fallout and how long that fallout is going to last.
Unflinching racism.
Yeah.
On its naked face.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I really like about Akira, is that it's unflinching. We talked about the violence and the sexuality, but really the raw emotion in an adolescent form. Like I can't tell you what I was like as a 13 or 14-year-old. My mother would probably be a better person, but I'm sure I was not too fun to deal with. And that goes into the plot of Akira of why did the army start with these kids before puberty? It's because they could be controlled. And Akira wound up being the perfect age and the perfect personality to contain that type of power. Tetsuo is right in the middle of puberty. Can't ride a bike right. Can't be in a gang without his best friend being the leader. Can't talk to girls. Can't kiss a girl for anything. All he can do is grab a wrench and hit somebody in the head at the high speed on his bike. That's all he can do, right? And that inferiority complex crossed with those hormones. And now you're going to insert unparalleled telekinetic and psychokinetic power. that's a bomb waiting to happen.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that goes a little deeper into my point about how my way into this was looking at how uncontrollable life feels for the teenager. And you're so right about how they chose little kids because they were much more malleable and manipulatable, I guess.
Yeah, and of course we haven't got to it yet, but the finale where Tetsuo is finally morphing, I mean, that's a pretty one-to-one comparison for puberty, of your body changing and not being able to control it, the process being so quick that it's shocking to you. You get the iconic metal arm there, reminiscent of also Star Wars. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I didn't even understand that when the first time I saw it happen. It was like, he just made an arm out of nothing, but you're kind of skipping over the mental power that he has achieved in order to make that happen. He is controlling matter outside his body. And that was Otomo's point. That kind of reminded me of the floating pin in Kubrick's 2001, which is another film that has great influence on Akira, as we'll see later. But Kubrick just lets this pin float in front of the camera for like a minute or so. And people, quite frankly, got bored. They were, why is he showing? I understand that he's in gravity, but these are sci-fi people. That's not what Kubrick was going after. Kubrick was trying to explain to you, man is not in control of his environment. This is bad. This is when bad things happen. And that's what Kubrick was trying to get across with this point. And that's what I missed the first time I'd seen Akira, when he made the arm out of nothing, or when they make the teddy bear out of these parts that are just kind of lying around, when they're manipulating something. I just saw it as something, you've seen 1,000 cartoons by now, you've seen 1,000 movies by now. Just go with the flow. Just watch the movie. Just what did you think? I wasn't actually thinking Tetsuo is actually manipulating things to his purpose, using these powers that he got into this collision with Takashi. And I failed to connect those dots. And that's when I say you might need to watch Akira 2 times, 3 times, 15.
Yeah. Well, I studied literature in undergrad, and my advisor, who we've had on the podcast twice now, and we'll probably have a million more times, always told me that you need to read a book more than once to really get the meat out of it. And when I was in college, I was like, I don't have time enough to read books multiple times. Like, that's ridiculous. I'm still trying to catch up on what's out there, But now that we have a podcast, there's no way I'm walking into a podcast watching a movie one time or reading the book one time. Like, I am immersing myself in all of what's out there before I start talking about it, because there's so many layers, and we always miss layers too. There's never enough time to talk about everything you want to get to. But especially, I think another thing about watching something like Akira over and over is like the amount of time that goes by between watches is important for you to grow and change. And then, you pick things up when you're at different ages. And this is something that I think will just keep morphing because there's just so much here.
I'm going to bring up someone that I try never to bring up in my podcast, which is Pauline Kael. Pauline Kael was like one of the most influential movie critics ever, and she had a brilliant mind, and she was the birther of the hot take. And sometimes I would read things that Pauline Kael would read, and it would just make me want to shred her book. And I don't know if she was just trying to have that violent reaction out of you and just trying to create the hot take. I don't think so. I think she truly thought these things. And one of the things that she said was, brace yourself. I only watch movies once. That's all she needed. You try to get through this. That's crazy.
I mean,
that I don't understand how you could. Yeah. Like I'm familiar with her as a movie critic, and I just don't understand how you think you could do your job. Well, like I find that really hard to believe. I don't know. Cause even with this movie, I watched it once and it was a lot, and I was like, it's going to take me a while to want to dive into this. And now we're watching it again, like Ryan said, 6 weeks later or so. And I'm like, I'm in it again. I'm here, and I'm picking up a lot more.
And I'm just now really noticing the veins coming out of his arm. I know, Ryan, you had mentioned that in previous talks of this being one of your most favorite like visceral images from the movie. It's really standing out this time around.
It's kind of the first time where we see him lose control.
Yeah.
Tetsuo lose control of whatever, he's come to understand is this power, and it grows and it's in parallel with his emotions. Like when he gets mad, you see everything kind of flex, and he crushed the chair with that hand.
When he pulls out,
this is the moment where things start to go pretty south for him.
The pulsating technology is such an interesting visual because it's fully mechanical, metal, but it has that pulse of an artery. It's just
showing humans' connection to technology, more specifically technology of power, like guns or weapons of mass destruction. And it's being so gross. It's being conveyed as this just disease that is spreading, kind of, going back to that message of how power is getting out of hand, of how through technology, certain advancements have actually, it's gone too far.
Well, say it together with me, people. With great power
comes responsibility.
Comes great responsibility.
And Tetsuo has none.
Yes.
Right. And he is failing to control this part of his biological changing because he doesn't understand it. In theory, if he had just listened to the colonel, let us test you, let us find out what's going on with you, and let us help you, Tetsuo would be probably in a better position to manage this. Mm-hmm. But as an adolescent, he's incapable of doing anything that authority tells him to do.
Right.
And that's I think that says a lot about that. Yeah. I mean, I've got 2 teenagers.
Yeah. You're in the middle of it.
3 words. Fuck that shit. I'm not doing that. I'm not taking out the garbage. I'm not listening to him. I'm not doing my homework. I'm not doing anything you say. No, I'm not listening to your podcast. I don't care if it's on Akira.
This might be a little bit of a real long shot, but those stadium lights, next time you see him, if we see him again, they look exactly like the Weyland-Yutani symbol from Aliens. Like the same shape with the W.
Oh, yeah.
Ryan, you just won the podcast.
I thought I won with a Rogue One reference, but...
Yeah, that was usually topped by the Weyland-Yutani pull.
Shoot. All right, I need to come up with another...
That was a deep pull.
What are your favorite movies, David?
Canada!
Oh, it's so gross, but I can't look away.
That is puberty, my friend.
Oh, it is. That's exactly what puberty is.
Yeah,
sure.
This is exactly where I came up. This is where I was like, oh my God, big mouth. Like, the hormone monsters. Like, this is
the tentacles.
100% hormone tumor, I think is like the way that I want to describe that.
That is a teenage boy.
Yeah.
You can even liken it to the adults in Jurassic Park of that same message of scientific breakthrough without discipline leads to, literal monsters. In this case, the adults in Jurassic Park very much are stand-ins for teenagers, like teenage behaviors, thinking like, I want to do this thing. I don't want to worry about the consequences. And of course, the consequences end up literally eating you alive.
Yeah, I think going back to this scene, the idea of how toxic masculinity ends up perpetuating violence against female bodies, like, I think it's really poignant that, if a young female dies as a result of this hormone explosion. Yeah. Like, it's probably a little far if you think about most American teenagers or most, teenagers around the world, that they're going to murder their love interest, but it certainly happened. And I think it's not an accident. Like you were saying, he's very intentional about his imagery, and it's not just another guy that's killed in this.
It is no secret. I think it's in the high 87% or 89% percentile of almost all victims of sexual violence are women. Mm-hmm. and all the perpetrators, at least in that high percentile, are men.
Right.
What we lack in Corey not having more scenes here is, like I was saying before, her death impacts Tetsuo greatly in the manga. And you just kind of lose that. She's on screen, she dies, and in a very disgusting way. And you're left sort of, well, and Tetsuo says, like, I'm feeling her pain and it's hurting me. But without her hanging out with him, trying to empathize with him and be with him, you're kind of left out on what that really means for him.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So as a female character, I think she needed more screen time. Any female. I mean, Akira does not pass the Bechdel test.
No, not at all.
But I mean, most films don't pass the Bechdel test. I don't think I've covered a film on the Super 70 podcast that does.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. Like we've gotten some feedback about the diversity of our topics and authors and directors. And I'm not using this as an excuse, but it is difficult sometimes. And that's why we started doing the episodes on books we wish were movies, so that we could get some more diversity in there. But again, I'm not using that as an excuse, but sometimes it's difficult to find that.
It's a great...
go through that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, great example of less is more here with showing just Akira briefly, and then that's all you need to really get the impact of course, it's the complete inverse in the series, but that's just because you had more time there. I think since they had a limited amount of time, to just show Akira briefly, I think made it even more impactful and bittersweet.
And the Colonel survival makes much more sense here. They're in the manga. Like, a lot of people survive the second explosion, and you don't know why.
Yeah.
It's just kind of random. And I forgot to say it before. I couldn't work it in, but the whole cyberpunk aspect with the laser cannon and cyberpunk being so ingrained in Blade Runner and Alien and all this other things. Cyberpunk effectively is high-tech, low-life. And I don't know anything that embodies that more than Canada running around on this bike with a laser cannon.
Yeah.
And Aliens certainly took a lot of that cyberpunk influence from its original film, but also Akira, of having Ripley having that huge machine gun and flamethrower, producing one of the most iconic, like, female heroines in cinema.
And the disgusting nature of the face hugger.
Yeah.
All of particularly in Aliens 1986, where you see the inside of what the aliens had done to LB-426's compound, and then paralleling that to or comparing that to Tetsuo, and how he just blows up into this organism that you don't really comprehend or understand, or it's just gross or disgusting.
And I can't believe I'm bringing up this film, but Alien Resurrection, which is not a good film.
Oh, that's over the scale, but that's even more of that's a better comparison for sure.
Yeah, where it has that scene where Ripley finds the facility, very much like the Esper's facility, where the government or the company, Wayland, has been experimenting with the xenomorphs on people to kind of create these hybrids. So, yeah.
And here we go. We're friends again. And we didn't even scratch the surface when we came to Tetsuo. We really need to dive deep into that. I'm saving all my cards for the next episode. Otomo said, I wanted to revive a Japan like the one I grew up in after the Second World War, with a government in difficulty, a world being rebuilt, external political pressures, an uncertain future, and a gang of kids left to fend for themselves, even as they cheat boredom by racing on motorbikes.
Really poignant to have these flashbacks here at the height of the film. I've seen some criticism that they wanted these flashbacks, people wanted these earlier in the film for some more development, but I think placing them at the very end with Tetsuo being enveloped is what was the better decision.
No, it's a memory journey.
Yeah.
It's the same as the end of 2001. Where you're experiencing when Bowman is experiencing his life in different stages, and what it had been like if he had not left Earth.
So I want to ask a question because I haven't read all of the manga volumes, but why do you think that the children their faces become old? Is that just their energy being like sucked out of them for so long?
They keep them from aging because they don't want them to reach puberty.
Okay.
Because they want them to complete control. There's a fear that if they get, this is implied. This is not, correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan. This is not implicit in the novels. Mm-hmm. But the reason they have aged in these young bodies is because with these superpowers, they don't want them to become adolescents because they are afraid of Tetsuo this is what will happen.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But Lady Miyako is very aware of what will happen, like the military is, but she actually encourages Tetsuo of, look, if you want to reach your full potential and if you want to be like Akira or better than Akira, you're going to have to do this. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to stop taking those drugs and you're going to have to focus on what it is that's making you this way.
Yeah, that's what I interpreted the drugs as having a stunting effect mm-hmm. on your physical growth.
Hormonal growth, at least, yeah.
I don't remember exactly where it falls in which volume, but I think that's correct. There's an effect of either a drug or something that they've been given that affects just the physicality, their physicality.
Yeah, because there's a line in the manga where the colonel asks Tetsuo to come with them, and then Tetsuo is like, and spend a life looking like and he points to the espers.
Right.
Yeah.
And who wants to be 14 forever? Certainly not me.
No, thank you.
Oh gosh, no.
17, maybe 18, 20, probably
21,
perfect.
Yeah.
21 when you can legally drink.
Yes.
Oh yeah, you get the background between their friendship.
Yeah. And this is in the manga as well.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting how quickly, this is going back to the beginning, but how quickly young people sort of become a caste system. And like really the only reason that Tetsuo is on the bottom is because he like can't ride a motorcycle, or he's like a little bit younger, I think. And it just shows how quickly like children mirror what they're seeing around them. And I think that, they're seeing these people struggle for power and they're like, all right, well, that's what we're supposed to do. So who can we bully? Like, what can we find in this person? Or who says something dumb the first time that we can sort of put down and keep down below us? And then, of course, this backlash is going to happen. The first time that he gets some power, of course, he's going to use it against the people who kept him down.
Yeah, both stories do a great job at making the colonel very much like a frustrated dad figure. He's a figure of authority, but he very much is a father to, not a good father to the kids, people with power.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the same thing happens to him that happened to Corey.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. Squeezed in between matter.
Oof.
Somebody asked Otomo why there's so many explosions in his films.
Because they're dope. Explosions are dope.
He said, there's a reason why my stories feature so many devastating explosions. I'm unfortunately convinced that's how everything will end.
Oh, I mean, I see that though, coming from a Japanese person. I understand where that's coming from mm-hmm. because in America, we're so insulated. Like, I mean, we just passed September 11th and it's very traumatizing for people in America because that's one of the most recent / only attacks on U.S. soil, quote unquote. And that's unfortunately not the reality for so many people around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Like, most people in this world have a very difficult life that is traumatized by several experiences. And Americans in the 20th century, particularly, we've lost sight. We're in the 21st century. We've lost sight of that. It's been 20 years since we've had something hugely traumatic in our national mind. I'm a Cold War kid. I was born in 75, and I can tell you that the Cold War was real. That my teachers in grade school told me, like, look, everyone in this room is going to serve in the military in some function. And by the time that I was a teenager, I think that it was something like 60% of all Americans in the population had served in some way in a uniform or the Peace Corps or something like that. That's completely lost. That's completely gone. We've had no universal selective service since 1980. We've no skin in the game. We're completely divorced from our service personnel. And this feeling that I had as a kid of this might happen, of this, we all might die in some nuclear holocaust, of Terminator was real because of that, or Terminator 2 was in very recent memory, even though that came out after the Cold War was over. There's this idea, particularly with Reagan and Gorbachev and Helmut Kohl, that this was all something that was very real and very dangerous world that we were living in. And then when it was all over, there was a big sigh of relief. And we were like, oh, okay, well, we got through that all right. And our last war ended in 1973. And we're going to be okay now because we just pulled off this thing in the Middle East and we lost 300 soldiers and everything's fine. And we just floated along that way for a whole decade, just unknowing that we are just barreling towards this enormous catastrophe that not just for us, but for the entire world, particularly for the Afghan people. Right. But if you live in Japan, even though there's this thing that you don't talk about, which is Hiroshima, there's this national feeling of what happened to them. And a lot of them are still very pissed off about it. That the bomb was used against them in this way. And I remember when George H.W. Bush was president, and the prime minister of Japan had the gumption at the time to ask for an apology. George Bush was a fighter pilot in the Pacific War. Wrong fucking person to ask for an apology. Right. Maybe you should have waited to the next president. Probably would have gotten it. But the blowout from that, Clinton wasn't going to give that. Of course not. And quite frankly, I don't think we should apologize for something that we did in wartime in order to win. Didn't make it right. Didn't make it morally defensible. But that's what we did under the pressures of the time. That's how it happened. There's no change in that. Saying sorry is not going to help anybody. Not doing again, I think that's imperative. And if we can get rid of these damn things by using the Japanese as a case study, even better. Well, look how fucked up the world is because we did this thing that was horrible. And what Akira says about that, living in that national bomb, not very specifically, but living in a country that had that traumatized thing forced upon you. I can't imagine what that was like. And I think that we're getting a glimpse of that when we watch Akira. We're in the credits. Final thoughts, guys.
Yeah. Final thoughts. I really did not think that I was going to enjoy Akira when I started the manga, but I've come fully around to understanding the cultural significance of it, and I would watch it again.
Yeah. I love the way that the film has its cake and eats it too, where you have that intense political messaging, but it's not too overtly over the head in a way that it can't be consumed, or it's not pretentious. You also have the awesome action, and I'm just still in awe at the level of dedication, shown in creating a film, like a city, a world, a living, breathing organism that's so complex and rich in character, where every frame is drawn to perfection. I mean, it is truly a piece of art. So it's been a joy to discuss it.
It's one of my favorite films, and it has been for a while. And each time I watch it, I learn something new, or I try to, or I find myself looking at certain characters or happenings in the story through a different lens. And I think this time, through y'all's conversations, I viewed it much more as a commentary on adolescence and growth to maturity than I have in the past, I think. I mean, I usually have tended to try to understand, kind of the powers that are struggling to control one another. And this was, and kind of enlightening for me to really have a good take or look at it as and focus on the adolescence of the main characters involved and what the struggles are inherent in that stage of life. And something I thought of about 20 minutes ago was, I think you mentioned it earlier in terms of the first time you see the film, how you're left kind of holding the bag up until the end of the movie when they finally provide some semblance of understanding as to what is all going on. And it made me think of, these kids that are going through this don't know what the heck is going on throughout the story either. They're just kind of going as it and taking it as it comes. And you as the viewer are kind of tasked with that too. I mean, you're almost intentionally kept in the dark along the way up until the very end, and the characters and the viewer kind of come to understand everything that's happening at the same time, which is interesting. You have some characters like the colonel and the scientist or the doctor that have a better idea as to what's happening, but that's not really explicitly conveyed, to the audience or the main characters very well, especially in the movie. I mean, in the manga, it's a little bit more clearly stated. You understand what's going on a little bit better, but it's a phenomenal piece of work. It's a work of art, and it's very culturally important. And I hope that more people become aware of it and come to appreciate it for what it is. Both the manga and the film, they're both absolutely astounding, and I love both very dearly. And it's been a pleasure having the chance to discuss it with you guys.
Well, thanks very much, all of you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us on your podcast. This is wonderful.
Yeah.
Thanks for hanging out with me and the Film Is Lit podcast for this commentary on Akira. You can find Film Is Lit very easily on Facebook. Meta, or whatever. And you can find the Film Is Lit podcast anywhere you look for podcasts. You can find me, my books, and my blog on www.thatdylandavis.com. I'm Dylan Davis, and we'll meet next time at the Convento de San Jeronimo.